Tonight, before we travel back in time, if you'd like more quiet stories like this, you can gently tap like and subscribe so they're waiting for you when you need them. And if you're listening, whether it's your first time here or your 50th, feel free to leave a soft hello in the comments. It helps me know you're out there somewhere in the stillness. Now then, we're going back in time, not for a battle, not for a sword fight, not even for a dragon, just to see what it was like to wake up in a medieval town. Put on a pair of stiff-wooled trousers and try to make it through the day. No modern comforts, no hot showers, no buttons, no silence. This isn't the exciting part of history. This is the itchy part. The muddy part, the part where your feet hurt and breakfast is missing. We'll take it slow and walk through a day by the way someone might have in the year 1327. No rush, no danger. Just the soft discomfort of everyday medieval life. So settle in, get comfortable, and prepare to be grateful for your mattress, your toothpaste, and your socks as we explore why you wouldn't last a day in medieval times. Imagine, if you will, a world where the air itself seems to cling to you, not in a comforting way, like a warm blanket on a chilly evening, but in a way that makes you wish you could peel it off. This was the reality for those living in medieval Europe, where the concept of fresh air was about as foreign as indoor plumbing. You see, in those days, towns weren't exactly known for their cleanliness. There were no garbage trucks rumbling down cobblestone streets, no army of street sweepers armed with brooms and dustpans. Instead, the streets were a free-fall of discarded food, animal droppings, and things we'd rather not think about too closely. And speaking of animals, they were everywhere. Horses clip-clopping down the main road, chickens pecking at whatever scraps they could find, and the occasional pig snuffling about. It was like living in a very smelly petting zoo. Except the animals weren't confined to a pen, and there was no hand sanitizer station at the exit. Now, you might think that escaping to the countryside would provide some relief, a breath of fresh air, perhaps. Well, not quite. While it might have been a slight improvement, the countryside had its own unique bouquet. Fields were fertilized with, let's just say, natural materials, and the wind carried all sorts of interesting scents from nearby farms. But surely, you might think, one could find respite in the comfort of their own home. Ah, if only. Houses in medieval times were often small, cramped affairs, and with most cooking and heating done over open fires indoors, the air inside was often thick with smoke. It was like camping, but without the fun parts and with more coughing. Now, you might be wondering why people didn't just take a bath to freshen up. Well, bathing wasn't exactly a daily occurrence back then. For many, it was more of a special occasion kind of thing, like getting a haircut or going to the dentist, but probably more pleasant than the latter. Imagine waking up each morning, not to the gentle chime of your smartphone alarm, but to the pungent reminder that you're living in a time before deodorant was invented. You'd stretch, yawn, and immediately be hit with a wave of, well, let's just call it medieval morning breath, as you'd make your way downstairs, careful not to disturb the chickens that have somehow found their way into your living room again. You would be greeted by the lingering aroma of last night's dinner, and the night before that, and possibly the entire week's worth of meals, all mingling together in a culinary time capsule that no one asked for. Stepping outside wouldn't provide much relief. The narrow streets would already be bustling with activity, and by activity I mean a parade of scents that would make even the most adventurous food critic pause. There's the baker, sure, with his fresh bread. But there's also the tanner working on leather, the blacksmith's forge belching smoke, and let's not forget our friend, the local fishmonger, whose wares announce their presence long before you see them. You'd make your way through town, playing a real-life version of The Floor is Lava. Except in this game, the floor is, well, let's just say you'd want to watch your step, and your nose would be working overtime, trying to distinguish between the merely unpleasant and the potentially hazardous. Lunchtime would roll around, and you'd find yourself longing for a nice, clean restaurant with air conditioning and those little mints by the door. Instead, you'd probably be sharing your meal with a few uninvited guests of the six-legged variety, all while trying not to think too hard about where your food has been or who's been handling it. As the day wears on, you might find yourself daydreaming about a nice, hot shower. But unless you were particularly wealthy or lived near a bathhouse, that daydream would remain just that. Instead, you'd have to make do with a quick splash of water if you were lucky. And let's be honest, at this point in the day, it would be like trying to freshen up a compost heap with a spritz of cologne. Evening would bring a different set of olfactory challenges. As people returned home and fires were lit for warmth and cooking, the air would fill with a mix of wood smoke, body odor, and whatever was bubbling away in the communal pot. It was like a really intense aromatherapy session, except instead of relaxing, it just made your eyes water. And let's not forget about nighttime. You'd crawl into bed, which was probably stuffed with straw or feathers that had seen better days. As you lay there, trying to ignore the various itches and discomforts, you'd be serenaded by the night sounds of a medieval town, the distant bark of dogs, the scurrying of rats, and the occasional splash of something being emptied from an upstairs window onto the street below. But here's the thing. For the people living in medieval times, this was just ... normal. They didn't know any different. They didn't long for air fresheners or dream of HEPA filters. This was their world, and they navigated it as best they could. In a way, it's almost admirable. They went about their lives, fell in love, celebrated victories, and mourned losses, all while surrounded by an atmosphere that we modern folks would find unbearable. It just goes to show how adaptable humans can be. So the next time you find yourself complaining about a slightly musty smell in your basement, or the lingering aroma of last night's fish dinner, take a moment to appreciate how good we have it. Our ancestors would probably think we're living in some kind of scent-free paradise. And who knows, maybe centuries from now, people will look back at our time and wonder how we ever managed to live with the smell of car exhaust or the occasional whiff of garbage day. It's all a matter of perspective, really. As you drift off to sleep tonight in your clean, climate-controlled room, Maybe spare a thought for those medieval folks. They may not have had the comforts we take for granted, but they had something we sometimes lack: the ability to make the best of things, no matter how smelly those things might be. Imagine, if you will, a world where breakfast was not the comforting ritual we know today. A time when the morning meal was often nothing more than a distant dream. In medieval Europe, the concept of breakfast, as we understand it, simply didn't exist for most people. It's a thought that might make you feel a bit uneasy, like waking up to find your favorite pillow has mysteriously vanished in the night. Many individuals in those times would rise with the sun, their stomachs as empty as a forgotten cookie jar. They'd begin their day without so much as a morsel to sustain them. It's rather like trying to start your car without any fuel in the tank. A futile effort, really. When meals did occur, they were far from the elaborate affairs we're accustomed to now. Picture, if you can, a plate with nothing but a chunk of dry bread and perhaps a small wedge of cheese. No artisanal sourdough or carefully crafted brie, just simple, plain fare that would make even the most enthusiastic bread lover sigh with disappointment. The absence of fresh fruits and vegetables was another small discomfort that medieval folk had to endure. Unlike today, where we can pop into a store and pick up a crisp apple or a ripe banana any time of year, our ancestors were at the mercy of the seasons. Imagine craving a juicy peach in the depths of winter, only to remember that such luxuries were months away. It's like reaching for your favorite snack, only to find the container empty. A tiny tragedy, repeated day after day. When it came to quenching their thirst, medieval Europeans had options that were, shall we say, less than thrilling. Their drinks were often weak and bland, lacking the sweetness we've come to expect. No sugary sodas or flavored lattes to perk up their mornings. Instead, they might sip on watered-down ale or thin wine. Drinks that would make even the most polite modern guest struggle to hide their grimace. The absence of our beloved breakfast staples would be particularly jarring. No cheerful boxes of cereal lining the shelves. No stack of fluffy pancakes dripping with syrup. No steaming mug of coffee to chase away the morning fog. It's like waking up on Christmas morning to find that Santa has decided to take the year off. A small disappointment, but one that would accumulate over time, wearing away at one's spirits like water on a stone. Imagine starting your day without the comfort of a warm beverage. No tea to soothe your throat. No hot chocolate to warm your hands on a chilly morning. It's like trying to start a conversation without saying hello. Possible, but decidedly awkward. The medieval breakfast, when it did occur, was a far cry from the most important meal of the day we now know. It was often nothing more than a piece of bread, perhaps softened in ale, if you were lucky. No carefully crafted avocado toast or perfectly poached eggs. Just a humble slice of sustenance to tide you over until the main meal of the day. For those accustomed to a hearty breakfast to fuel their morning activities, this lack would be particularly challenging. It's akin to trying to run a marathon after skipping dinner the night before. Possible, perhaps, but certainly not pleasant. The absence of variety in the medieval diet would likely become tedious over time. day after day of the same simple foods, with little change to look forward to. It's rather like watching the same episode of your favorite show on repeat. Enjoyable at first, perhaps, but increasingly less so with each viewing. The concept of breakfast as a social occasion was also largely absent in medieval times. No leisurely weekend brunches with friends, no family gatherings over a spread of morning delicacies. The day often began with work, not waffles. It's like waking up on your birthday, only to find that everyone has forgotten the occasion. A small sadness, but one that would color the rest of your day. Poor, even for those who did partake in a morning meal. The experience was far from the leisurely affair we might enjoy today. Breakfast, when it occurred, was often a hurried, practical matter. No lingering over the morning paper with a second cup of coffee. It was more akin to grabbing a granola bar as you rush out the door. Functional, but hardly satisfying. The lack of hot drinks to start the day would be particularly noticeable in the colder months. Imagine waking up on a frosty morning, your breath visible in the chilly air, with nothing warm to wrap your hands around. It's like putting on a sweater fresh from the dryer, only to find it's actually been sitting in a cold, damp basement. A small shock to the system that sets the tone for the rest of the day. For those with a sweet tooth, the medieval morning would be particularly challenging. No pastries, no jam for your bread, no honey to drizzle over your porridge. The day would start on a savory note, whether you liked it or not. It's rather like opening a box of assorted chocolates, only to find they're all filled with vegetables. A surprise, and not necessarily a pleasant one. The concept of breakfast foods as we know them simply didn't exist. There were no eggs Benedict, no breakfast burritos, no smoothie bowls. Meal times were less defined, with less distinction between what was eaten when. It's like living in a world where all meals are essentially the same. A monotony that would slowly wear away at one's enjoyment of food. For those accustomed to starting their day with a dose of caffeine, the medieval morning would be particularly challenging. No coffee to jolt you awake, no tea to gently ease you into consciousness. It's like trying to start your car with a dead battery. Possible with some effort, but far from ideal. The lack of refrigeration meant that even when fresh foods were available, they didn't last long. Milk, for instance, would quickly spoil without proper storage. Imagine pouring yourself a glass of milk, only to find it's turned sour overnight. A small disappointment, but one that would add to the overall challenge of daily life. In the absence of modern conveniences, preparing any kind of morning meal was a time-consuming process. No toasters to quickly crisp your bread, no microwaves to heat your porridge. Every step of food preparation required effort and planning. It's like trying to write a letter with a quill and ink when you're used to sending a quick text. Possible, but decidedly more complicated. The concept of breakfast on the go was entirely foreign. No grabbing a muffin and coffee on your way to work. No drive-through options for a quick bite. The day began when it began, and food came when it came. It's like trying to catch a bus that runs on its own mysterious schedule. You either adapt or you miss out entirely. For those with dietary restrictions or preferences, the medieval breakfast options would be particularly limited. No gluten-free bread, no dairy-free milk alternatives, no vegetarian breakfast sausages. You ate what was available, or you didn't eat at all. It's like going to a restaurant where the only option is the chef's choice. You might enjoy it, but you certainly don't have much say in the matter. In the end, the medieval breakfast, or lack thereof, serves as a reminder of how much our daily routines have changed over the centuries. It's a small window into a world that, while not so distant in time, feels impossibly far away in terms of comfort and convenience. A world where the simple pleasure of a morning meal was often nothing more than a dream, as elusive as a perfectly ripe strawberry in the depths of winter. Imagine, if you will, a time long ago when getting hurt was a much bigger deal than it is today. A time when even the smallest scratch could turn into something quite bothersome. It's hard to picture, isn't it? But that's how life was in medieval Europe. Let's take a slow, gentle stroll through those days, shall we? In those times, there were no modern medicines or first aid kits. No band-aids to quickly cover a cut. No antiseptic creams to ward off infection. Just imagine stubbing your toe on a rough stone floor. Ouch. But instead of hopping to the medicine cabinet, you'd have to hope it didn't get worse. People back then had different ideas about how the body worked. They thought illnesses were caused by an imbalance of 4 bodily fluids called humus. Sounds a bit silly now, doesn't it? But that's what they believed. So, if you got sick, they might try to balance these humours in ways that seem rather strange to us now. Even small injuries could take a long time to heal. A simple cut that we'd barely notice today could be a real problem back then. Without proper cleaning and care, it might get infected. And infections were tricky business in a world without antibiotics. So that little cut could keep you in bed for days, maybe even weeks. Imagine spending all that time just because of a tiny scratch. How inconvenient. Many people believed in balancing the body using methods that might make us raise an eyebrow today. For instance, they might use leeches to suck out what they thought was bad blood. Or they'd create small wounds to let out those unbalanced humours. It sounds a bit unpleasant, doesn't it? But they truly believed these methods would help. Doctors did their best, of course. They weren't trying to make things worse, but science was still catching up. They didn't know about germs or how diseases really spread. So their treatments were often based on guesswork and old traditions. Sometimes their cures might have been worse than the ailment itself. Imagine going to the doctor with a headache and leaving with a hole in your head to let out the bad spirits. Not very relaxing, is it? Now, let's think about everyday life. You wake up in the morning, but instead of a soft, warm bed, you're on a lumpy straw mattress. No alarm clock to wake you, just the crowing of a rooster or the tolling of church bells. You stretch and yawn, feeling a bit stiff from the hard bed. But there's no time to linger. There's work to be done. You get dressed, but your clothes aren't soft cotton or smooth polyester. They're rough wool or linen, often itchy and uncomfortable. And if you tear them, well, there's no quick trip to the store for new ones. You'd have to mend them yourself, or hope someone in your family was good with a needle and thread. Breakfast time comes, but forget about your favorite cereal or a quick piece of toast. Your morning meal might be a chunk of dense bread and some porridge. If you're lucky, maybe an egg from the family's chickens. No refrigerator to keep things fresh, so you have to be careful about what you eat and when. After breakfast, it's time for work. But it's not sitting at a desk in a climate-controlled office. No, you might be out in the fields, plowing or planting or harvesting. The sun beats down on you. There's no sunscreen to protect your skin. Your back aches from bending over all day. Your hands are rough and calloused from the tools you use. Or maybe you're a craftsperson working in a dim workshop. The light from candles or small windows isn't great for your eyes. You squint as you work, leading to headaches. And if you make a mistake, well, there's no eraser or undo button. You might have to start all over again. Lunchtime comes, but it's not much of a break. You might have some bread and cheese, maybe some vegetables if they're in season. No ice-cold drinks to refresh you, just room temperature water, or maybe some weak ale. And then it's back to work. As evening approaches, you're tired. Your body aches from the day's labor, but there's still more to do. Animals to feed, fires to tend, maybe some mending or other chores. No flipping a switch for light or heat. You have to carefully tend the fire. Make sure you have enough candles or lamp oil. Dinner is probably the biggest meal of the day, but don't expect much variety. Meat is a luxury for most people, so you might have some more bread, maybe some stew with whatever vegetables are available. No spices from far-off lands to make things interesting. Just simple, often bland food. After dinner, there's not much to do. No TV to watch. No books to read. Unless you're one of the few who can read and have access to books. Maybe you listen to stories told by elders or sing songs together. But mostly, you go to bed early. You need to rest for another day of hard work tomorrow. And speaking of bed, remember that lumpy straw mattress? Well, you might be sharing it with several family members. Privacy wasn't really a thing back then. And if nature calls in the middle of the night, no indoor plumbing. You'd have to venture outside to an outhouse or just use a chamber pot. Throughout all this, you're constantly aware of the potential for injury or illness. A splinter from your wooden tools could lead to infection. A fall while working could mean a broken bone that never heals quite right. Even a small cut while preparing food could become serious without proper care. And if you do get sick or injured, well, there's no calling in sick to work. No sick days or paid time off. You either work through it or risk not having enough food or money. And if it's serious enough that you can't work, well, that could be a real problem for you and your family. So, you see, getting hurt or sick in medieval times was indeed a much bigger deal than it is today. Every day was filled with small discomforts and potential dangers that we rarely think about now. It makes you appreciate the comforts and medical knowledge we have today, doesn't it? But let's not dwell on the difficulties. Instead, let's be grateful for our warm, soft beds, our readily available medicines, and our understanding of how to prevent and treat illnesses and injuries. It's quite amazing how far we've come, isn't it? And with that comforting thought, perhaps it's time to rest our eyes and drift off to sleep, thankful for the time we live in now. Imagine, if you will, a world where your clothes are always just a little bit uncomfortable, where every step you take is accompanied by a subtle scratch or an awkward tug. This was the reality of medieval Europe, where the simple act of getting dressed each morning was far from the effortless routine we know today. In those distant times, most clothes were made from materials that would make our modern skin crawl. Wool, for instance, was a common fabric choice. But this wasn't the soft, fluffy wool we might think of now. No, this was rough, coarse wool that felt more like wearing a sheep than wearing a sweater. It would catch on your skin, leaving little red marks and a constant urge to scratch. And then there was linen. Linen sounds nice, doesn't it? Cool and breezy. But medieval linen was a far cry from the smooth sheets we enjoy today. It was often stiff and unyielding, like wrapping yourself in a slightly softer version of tree bark. The fibers were hand-processed, which meant they weren't always evenly textured. You might find yourself with a shirt that was smooth in some places and rough in others, a constant reminder of the imperfections of handmade goods. Speaking of handmade, that's how all fabrics were produced back then. There were no machines to ensure consistency, no quality control measures to guarantee softness. Each piece of clothing was a unique creation, for better or worse. Often it was for worse. The threads might be uneven, creating lumps and bumps in unexpected places. The weave might be too tight in some areas and too loose in others, leading to an overall fit that was never quite right. Now, let's talk about fasteners, or rather, the lack thereof. In our modern world, we take for granted the ease of zipping up a jacket or buttoning a shirt. But in medieval times, these conveniences simply didn't exist. Zippers were centuries away from being invented. Buttons, while they did exist, were often more decorative than functional. Instead, people relied on laces, ties, and pins to keep their clothes in place. Imagine trying to lace up your shirt every morning, fumbling with tiny strings while your fingers are still stiff from sleep. Or picture yourself attempting to pin your cloak just right, hoping it won't slip off your shoulders at an inopportune moment. It's a far cry from the quick zip or button we're used to. And let's not forget about waistbands. We're spoiled now with elastic, allowing our pants to stretch and move with us. Medieval folk had no such luxury. Their waistbands were fixed, often tied or belted in place. If you ate a particularly hearty meal, there was no give in your clothing to accommodate your full belly. You'd simply have to loosen your belt and hope for the best. Now let's walk a mile in medieval shoes. Or perhaps we should say, let's hobble a mile. Medieval footwear was a far cry from the cushioned, supportive shoes we slip our feet into today. Shoes back then were often made of hard leather, with soles that were little more than a slightly thicker piece of the same material. There was no arch support, no heel cushioning, no memory foam insole. Every step would have been a stark reminder of the ground beneath your feet. You'd feel every pebble, every uneven surface. Walking on cobblestone streets, your feet would remember it for days and forget about going for a jog or playing sports. These shoes were designed for basic protection and little else. But surely, you might think, they must have had some comfortable clothes for lounging around at home. Well, not really. The concept of loungewear, or pajamas as we know them, didn't exist. People often slept in the same clothes they wore during the day, or in simple nightshirts that were only marginally more comfortable than their daytime attire. And here's a thought that might make you squirm. Underwear as we know it didn't really exist either. People might wear a simple linen shift under their clothes, but it wasn't changed daily like our modern undergarments. It was more of a protective layer between skin and outerwear, often worn for extended periods without washing. Now, you might be thinking that at least in the summer, people could shed some layers and find relief from their itchy, uncomfortable clothes. But you'd be wrong. Medieval fashion dictated that people wear multiple layers, regardless of the season. This was partly for modesty, partly for warmth in drafty castles and homes, and partly because clothing was a sign of status. The more layers you wore, the more important you appeared. So picture this. It's a sweltering summer day. The sun is beating down, and there's not a cloud in the sky. You step outside wearing a linen shift, a wool tunic, a heavy overdress, and possibly a cloak. Your feet are encased in leather shoes that don't breathe. Your head is covered with a linen coif, and possibly a hat on top of that. You're sweating before you've taken 2 steps. But removing layers isn't an option. The fabric clings to your damp skin, chafing with every movement. The wool starts to smell as it absorbs your sweat. Your feet feel like they're baking in their leather ovens. But this is just how things were. There was no escape, no relief. This was simply the reality of getting dressed in medieval times. And let's not even get started on the process of washing these clothes. With no washing machines, no gentle detergents, and limited access to clean water, keeping clothes clean was a Herculean task. Often, clothes were worn for extended periods between washes, accumulating dirt, sweat, and odors. The itchiness of a freshly donned shirt was often preferable to the grime of one that had been worn for weeks. So, the next time you slip on your favorite soft t-shirt, or zip up a perfectly fitting jacket, or wiggle your toes in cushioned sneakers, take a moment to appreciate the comfort. Remember the scratchy wool, the unyielding linen, the hard leather shoes of medieval times. Consider how different your day would be if every moment was accompanied by the subtle discomfort of ill-fitting, roughly textured clothes. In our modern world, we often take for granted the simple pleasure of comfortable clothing. But for our medieval ancestors, such comfort was an unimaginable luxury. Their days were filled with constant reminders of the fabric against their skin, the weight of their layers, the pinch of their shoes. It was a different world, one where the very act of getting dressed was a testament to human endurance. So, tonight, as you change into your soft pajamas and slip between smooth sheets, spare a thought for those who came before us. Their itchy, awkward clothes paved the way for the comfort we enjoy today. And perhaps, in some small way, it might help you appreciate the simple joy of a comfortable outfit just a little bit more. Imagine, if you will, a time long ago when sleeping wasn't quite the cozy experience we've grown accustomed to. Picture yourself tired after a long day of, well, medieval things, ready to crawl into bed. But wait, what's this? Your bed isn't the plush, pillow-top mattress you're used to. Oh no, not at all. See, in those days, beds were a bit different. And by different, I mean they were often just piles of straw. Yes, straw. The same stuff you might find in a barn. If you were lucky, you might have a wooden frame to keep your straw off the floor. But let's be honest, a wooden frame isn't exactly memory foam, is it? Now, you might be thinking, well, at least I have the bed to myself. Oh, you sweet summer child. In medieval times, entire families often shared a single sleeping space. Imagine trying to get a good night's rest with your parents, siblings, and maybe even a grandparent or two, all snoring away next to you. It's like a very uncomfortable slumber party that never ends. But surely you could at least control the temperature, right? Wrong again. There was no such thing as indoor heating or air conditioning. In the winter, you'd be huddled under every blanket you owned, trying to keep your nose from freezing off. And in the summer, well, let's just say you'd probably be dreaming of ice baths. Now, let's talk about darkness. When night fell in medieval times, it fell hard. There were no streetlights to cast a comforting glow through your window. No, when the sun went down, it was dark, really dark. The kind of dark where you can't see your hand in front of your face. Hope you're not afraid of the dark. And just when you think you've finally drifted off to sleep, despite the lumpy straw, the snoring relatives, and the less than ideal temperature, you might be rudely awakened by, well, just about anything. Maybe it's a rooster crowing at an ungodly hour, or perhaps it's the town crier shouting the news at the top of his lungs, or it could be a local livestock deciding to have a midnight chat right outside your window. But don't worry, it's not all bad. At least you don't have to worry about your phone keeping you up all night. Mainly because phones won't be invented for another 1,000 years or so. Silver linings, right? So the next time you're lying in your comfortable bed with your thermostat set to the perfect temperature, enjoying the peaceful quiet of your private bedroom, spare a thought for your medieval ancestors. They were probably tossing and turning on their straw mattresses, shivering or sweating, surrounded by snoring family members, in pitch darkness, waiting for the rooster to wake them up at dawn. And if that doesn't make you appreciate your modern sleeping arrangements, well, I don't know what will. Sweet dreams, and be thankful you're not dreaming them in medieval Europe. But let's delve a bit deeper into this less than restful medieval slumber, shall we? Imagine, if you can, the subtle symphony of nighttime noises that would accompany your attempts at sleep. The gentle rustle of straw as you shift position, trying to find that one spot that doesn't poke you in uncomfortable places. The soft, and sometimes not so soft, snores of your family members, each with their own unique pitch and rhythm. And let's not forget about the delightful aroma that might permeate your sleeping quarters. With no modern plumbing or waste management systems, the air might be, shall we say, fragrant, especially if you lived in a bustling town or city. It's amazing how quickly you might find yourself longing for the fresh scent of country air, even if it does come with the occasional whiff of cow. Now, you might be wondering about pillows. Surely they had pillows, right? Well, yes and no. If you were lucky enough to have a pillow, it might be stuffed with feathers. Sounds nice, doesn't it? Until you realize that those feathers probably came from the same chickens that are now waking you up at dawn. And let's not even talk about the potential for little creepy crawlies making their home in your bedding. Sweet dreams, indeed. But wait, there's more. Remember how we mentioned it was dark? Well, that darkness wasn't just inconvenient. It could be downright scary. Without our modern understanding of science and the natural world, the night was often seen as a time of danger and mystery. Every unexplained sound could be a ghost, a demon, or worse. It's enough to make you pull the covers over your head. If you had covers, that is. Speaking of covers, let's talk about blankets. In the winter, you'd pile on every scrap of fabric you could find. Wool was a popular choice, if you could afford it. But wool, while warm, isn't exactly known for its softness. So now you're not just cold, you're also itchy. It's like trying to sleep while wearing a very large, very scratchy sweater. And in the summer, well, you might find yourself longing for those itchy wool blankets. With no fans or air conditioning, a hot summer night could be truly miserable. You might even find yourself sleeping outside, braving the bugs and potential predators, just to catch a cool breeze. But surely, you think, at least the bed itself was comfortable, right? Well, if by comfortable you mean slightly better than sleeping on the ground, then yes, absolutely. The average medieval bed was essentially a wooden frame with ropes stretched across it. These ropes would sag over time, leading to the phrase, sleep tight. You'd have to tighten the ropes regularly to keep your bed from becoming a hammock. And let's not forget about the joys of sharing your sleeping space with various uninvited guests. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were common companions for medieval sleepers. It gives a whole new meaning to the phrase, "Don't let the bedbugs bite," doesn't it? But perhaps the most challenging aspect of medieval sleep wasn't the physical discomfort, but the schedule itself. In many places, people practiced what's known as segmented sleep. They would go to bed shortly after sunset, sleep for a few hours, wake up for an hour or two in the middle of the night, and then go back to sleep until dawn. During this midnight waking period, people might pray, chat with family members, or even visit neighbors. Imagine trying to explain to your boss that you're tired because your midnight chat with the neighbors ran long. It's not exactly the kind of excuse that would fly in today's 9to5 world. So the next time you find yourself tossing and turning, unable to sleep, just remember, at least you're tossing and turning on a comfortable mattress in a temperature-controlled room, without the fear of ghosts, demons, or roosters interrupting your slumber. And if that doesn't help you drift off to dreamland, well, you could always try counting sheep. Just be thankful those sheep aren't sharing your bedroom. In the end, perhaps we should be grateful for our modern sleep amenities. Our ancestors might have dreamed of such luxuries if they could get to sleep in the first place, that is. So tonight, as you snuggle into your soft, warm bed, take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. And if you hear a rooster crow, well, at least you can hit the snooze button on your alarm clock. Sweet dreams, and may your sleep be decidedly unmedieval. Imagine, if you will, a time when water wasn't trusted. Yes, you heard that right. The very substance we now guzzle from fancy bottles and filtered taps was once viewed with suspicion. In medieval times, drinking water was sometimes unsafe. It's not that people didn't want to trust water, mind you. It's just that water had a bit of a reputation for being, well, not always the friendliest to one's insides. You see, back then, the concept of water treatment was about as foreign as a smartphone would be to a medieval peasant. Rivers and streams, which were often the main sources of water, could be quite unpredictable in their contents. One day, you might be sipping crystal clear water, and the next, you'd be gulping down something that looked more like a muddy puddle. But don't worry. Our medieval friends weren't constantly parched. They had a solution, albeit a slightly unusual one by our standards. Weak ale was the drink of choice, even for children. Yes, you heard that correctly. Little Timmy and Sally weren't sipping on apple juice boxes, but rather nursing mugs of watered-down beer. Now, before you start thinking medieval Europe was one big tavern party, let me assure you, this ale was nothing like the strong stuff we know today. It was more like a very mild, slightly fermented grain water. The alcohol content was so low that it wouldn't make anyone tipsy, but it was just enough to kill off some of those pesky waterborne nasties. Imagine sending your child off to school with a flask of weak ale instead of a water bottle. It's a bit like packing a lunch of turnips and gruel instead of a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Different times, different customs, I suppose. This weak ale wasn't just for the youngsters, though adults would sip on it throughout the day, quenching their thirst without the worry of what might be lurking in the local water supply. It was the medieval equivalent of carrying around a reusable water bottle, except instead of trendy designs and motivational quotes, these containers were filled with mildly alcoholic grain water. But what about water, you might ask? Surely they used it for something. Well, yes, they did. Water was for washing, not sipping. It was the medieval equivalent of our cleaning supplies aisle. Need to wash your hands. Water. Want to clean your clothes. Water. Fancy a bath. Well, water again, although baths were a bit of a luxury and not an everyday occurrence. Picture, if you will, a world where turning on a tap for a glass of clean, safe drinking water was as foreign a concept as time travel is to us. Where the idea of gulping down a refreshing glass of water on a hot day was met with raised eyebrows and concerned looks. It's a bit like if we suddenly decided that drinking orange juice was dangerous, and instead we all started sipping on very weak, room-temperature tea all day. It would take some getting used to, wouldn't it? But our medieval friends were nothing if not adaptable. They went about their days, sipping their weak ale, washing with water, and probably never giving it a second thought. It was just the way things were done. Imagine the confusion of a time traveler from medieval Europe arriving in our world. They'd probably be baffled by our water fountains, wondering why on earth we were encouraging people to drink from them. They might look at our bottled water aisles in supermarkets with the same bewilderment we'd have looking at a shop selling nothing but different types of dirt, and think about the children. Little medieval Johnny and Jane, growing up thinking that weak ale was the normal thing to drink. They'd probably find the idea of drinking plain water as strange as we find the thought of them sipping ale. It's all a matter of perspective, isn't it? But let's not judge our medieval ancestors too harshly. They were just doing their best with what they had. After all, they didn't have the benefit of modern water treatment plants or an understanding of microscopic organisms. To them, clear water that didn't make you sick right away was about as good as it got. It's a bit like how we view air pollution today. We know it's not great for us, but we can't always see it. So we go about our days breathing it in anyway. Our medieval friends were doing the same with their water, just with a bit more ale involved. And let's be honest, there's something almost charming about the idea of a society where even the children were allowed to have a bit of ale. It's like they were all living in one big, very mild, never-ending Oktoberfest, minus the lederhosen and Oompa bands, of course. But before we get too carried away with the idea of medieval Europe as one big ale-fueled party, let's remember that life back then was far from easy. The weak ale might have been safer to drink than water, but it wasn't exactly a refreshing glass of iced tea on a hot summer's day. Imagine trying to quench your thirst with something that was essentially watered down, room temperature beer. Not exactly the most appealing thought, is it? It's a bit like trying to satisfy your hunger with nothing but dry crackers. It might keep you going, but it's not going to win any culinary awards. And let's not forget about the logistics of it all. In a world without refrigerators or preservatives, keeping a steady supply of weak ale on hand was no small feat. It required constant brewing, careful storage, and a lot of planning. It's a bit like if we had to bake our own bread every single day just to have something to eat. But our medieval friends took it all in strides. They went about their days, sipping their weak ale, washing with water, and probably never giving it a second thought. It was just the way things were done. So the next time you turn on your tap and fill a glass with clean, safe drinking water, take a moment to appreciate it. It's a luxury our medieval ancestors could only dream of. And maybe, just maybe, raise a glass of water in their honor. They'd probably think you were a bit odd for doing so, but it's the thought that counts. Imagine, if you will, a world where bathing was not a daily ritual, but an occasional event. In medieval Europe, the concept of personal hygiene was quite different from what we know today. People didn't wake up each morning and hop into a steamy shower. No. That would have been far too convenient and, frankly, a bit suspicious to their neighbors. Instead, bathing was a public affair. Yes, you heard that right. Public bathing houses were the place to be if you wanted to indulge in a good scrub. Picture, if you can, a large room filled with wooden tubs, steam rising from the warm water, and the gentle murmur of conversation. It was like a spa day, but with more lice and less cucumber water. These bathing houses were social hubs, where people would gather to gossip, relax, and occasionally remember to wash themselves. It was a bit like a modern-day coffee shop, but with more naked people and fewer laptops. The water in these tubs was changed. Well, let's just say not as often as we might hope. But hey, who doesn't love a good soup of communal grime? Now, you might be wondering, what about soap? Surely they had soap. Well, dear listener, they did have soap. But it wasn't the pleasant, lavender-scented bars we're used to today. Oh no, medieval soap was a whole different beast. Soap in those days was made from animal fat. Yes, you heard that correctly. The same stuff that made your roast pork so deliciously greasy was also responsible for getting you clean, or at least what passed for clean in those days. The process of making soap was a bit like cooking. If your idea of cooking involved rendering animal fat and mixing it with lye, it was a messy, smelly business that often took place in the same areas where people tanned leather. So, if you ever find yourself transported back in time to medieval Europe, just follow your nose to the nearest soap maker. You can't miss it. It'll be the place that smells like a combination of a butcher's shop and a chemistry experiment gone wrong. The resulting soap was a far cry from the colorful, sweetly scented bars we're used to today. It was often brown or gray, with a texture that could best be described as chunky. And the smell, well, let's just say it was an acquired taste. Or rather, an acquired scent. But don't worry, dear listener. This soap wasn't used very often. After all, bathing itself was a rare occurrence. Most people were content to go about their daily lives in a state that we might politely call earthy. The general belief was that too much bathing could open up your pores and let in evil spirit. And who wants to risk that just for the sake of smelling nice? Instead of regular baths, people would often just change their linen undergarments. The idea was that the linen would absorb the sweat and oils from the skin, acting as a sort of medieval dry cleaning. It wasn't perfect, but it was certainly less effort than hauling buckets of water and heating them over a fire just for a wash. For those times when you absolutely had to clean up, perhaps for a special occasion like a wedding or a coronation, there were other options besides a full bath. People would often just wash their hands and face, using a basin of water and a cloth. It was like a medieval version of freshening up in an airplane bathroom, but with less turbulence and more risk of plague. Speaking of plague, you might think that all this lack of washing would lead to terrible diseases, and you'd be right, of course. But medieval people had their own ideas about what caused illness. They believed that bad smells could make you sick, so they often carried sweet-smelling herbs or pomanders to ward off disease. It was like medieval hand sanitizer, but less effective and more decorative. Now, let's take a moment to imagine what all this meant for everyday life. Picture yourself waking up in the morning in a world without showers or deodorant. You'd roll out of your straw-filled mattress, put on the same clothes you've been wearing for weeks, and head out to face the day. Your hair would be a tangled mess. Your skin would be covered in a fine layer of grime. And you'd probably have a few uninvited guests living in your clothes. But here's the thing, nobody would bat an eye. This was normal. Everyone smelled a bit funky, so you wouldn't stand out. It was a great equalizer, really. Whether you were a peasant or a noble, chances are you'd all have that same medieval musk. Of course, there were some people who did bathe more often. The very wealthy could afford private baths in their homes, filled with hot water and sometimes even scented with herbs or flower petals. It was the height of luxury, like having a hot tub in your backyard today, but with more risk of catching something nasty from the water. Monasteries, too, often had better hygiene practices. Monks were expected to keep themselves clean as part of their spiritual duties. They had elaborate rituals for washing their hands before meals, and even full baths on special occasions. It was like a spa retreat, but with more prayer and less pampering. But for most people, cleanliness was a distant concept, something they might experience a few times a year if they were lucky. The rest of the time, they just got on with life, accepting the grime and the smell as part of the human condition. So, dear listener, as you drift off to sleep tonight, be thankful for your modern conveniences. Be grateful for your daily showers, your scented soaps, and your clean, freshly laundered clothes. And if you ever find yourself complaining about having to do laundry or clean the bathroom, just remember, it could be worse. You could be living in medieval Europe, where a bath was a rare luxury and soap was a mysterious substance made from animal fat. As we come to the end of our journey through medieval hygiene, let's take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. From public bathhouses to private showers, from animal fat soap to lavender-scented body wash, we've made quite a leap. So the next time you lather up, spare a thought for your medieval ancestors. They might not have been as clean as us, but they certainly had a more interesting approach to personal hygiene. All right, let's drift back to a time when life moved at a different pace, a much slower, more laborious pace. Imagine, if you will, the gentle rustling of leaves in a medieval village, the soft clucking of chickens, and the distant clanging of a blacksmith's hammer. It's a peaceful scene, isn't it? But beneath that tranquil surface lies a world of constant work and little rest, a world where the concept of free time was as foreign as indoor plumbing. Pret, you see. In those days, you always had to be working. It wasn't a choice, really. It was just ... how things were. The sun would rise, and with it, so would you. No hitting the snooze button on your alarm clock, mainly because alarm clocks hadn't been invented yet, but also because there was work to be done. Always work to be done. Weekends, oh, those weren't a thing either. The idea of having 2 whole days off every week would have seemed like a fairy tale to our medieval friends. Saturday and Sunday were just, well, they were just more days. More days to work, that is. The fields didn't care what day it was. The crops needed tending, the animals needed feeding, and the never-ending cycle of chores waited for no one. Speaking of chores, everyone had them. And I do mean everyone. from the tiniest tot who could barely walk to the oldest grandparent whose back was permanently bent from years of labor. There was always something that needed doing, always a task waiting to be completed. It was like a very unfun, never-ending game of I Spy. Except instead of spying things, you were constantly spotting more work that needed to be done. Little Timmy might be put to work gathering eggs from the chickens. His older sister Sarah could be found helping to churn butter or mend clothes. Even dear old Grandpa, with his creaky joints and fading eyesight, would be whittling away at some wood or repairing tools. It was a family affair, this constant working, a real bonding experience, if you will. Nothing brings a family together quite like shared misery, right? Now, you might be thinking, surely they must have had some time to rest, and you'd be right. Sort of. Rest was indeed a thing that existed. It just wasn't very common. And when it did happen, it was usually pretty short. Imagine taking a quick nap, but instead of waking up refreshed, you're jolted awake by the realization that those carrots aren't going to pick themselves. Rest was a luxury, a fleeting moment snatched between tasks. It was the brief pause you'd take to catch your breath after lugging buckets of water from the well, or the few precious minutes you'd spend leaning on your hoe in the field, pretending to survey your work while actually just trying not to pass out from exhaustion. These moments were rare and cherished, like finding a perfectly ripe strawberry in a field of green ones. But even these stolen moments of rest weren't truly restful. There was always the nagging knowledge that work was waiting, always the mental list of tasks yet to be completed. It was like trying to relax on a bed of pine needles. Sure, you could do it, but it wasn't exactly comfortable, and you were always aware of the prickles. Now, let's take a moment to really sink into this feeling. Close your eyes if you'd like. Imagine the weight of constant work on your shoulders. Feel the ache in your muscles from endless toil. Hear the distant voice of a parent or spouse calling you back to your chores, just as you've sat down for a moment's peace. It's not a particularly pleasant feeling, is it? But it's one our medieval ancestors lived with every day. In this world of constant work, even sleep wasn't a guaranteed respite. You might crawl into your lumpy straw bed at night, exhausted from a day of labor, only to be woken before dawn by a crowing rooster. Or perhaps you'd be roused in the middle of the night to tend to a birthing animal, or to keep watch for potential dangers. Sleep, like everything else, was a luxury that often had to be sacrificed for the never-ending demands of survival. But let's not paint too grim a picture. After all, this was just ... life. It was all they knew. And humans are remarkably adaptable creatures. They found ways to make the work more bearable. They sang songs as they toiled in the fields. They told stories while mending clothes or repairing tools. They found moments of joy in the simplest things. A particularly good harvest, a warm, sunny day, the laughter of children playing between chores. And there was a certain satisfaction in the work itself, a sense of purpose and accomplishment that came from knowing that every task, no matter how small or mundane, contributed to the survival and well-being of the family and community. It wasn't an easy life by any means, but it was a life with meaning. It makes you appreciate the modern concept of leisure time, doesn't it? The ability to clock out at the end of a workday and know that your time is your own. The luxury of weekends spent lounging in pajamas or pursuing hobbies just for the fun of it. These are comforts our medieval counterparts could scarcely have imagined. So the next time you find yourself grumbling about having to do the dishes or mow the lawn, take a moment to be grateful. Grateful that these tasks are just a small part of your day, not your entire existence. Grateful for the invention of labor-saving devices and the concept of free time. Grateful that you can choose to rest without feeling guilty about neglecting some vital task. Now, imagine, if you will, a world where your shoes were as flat as a pancake and about as supportive as a wet noodle. That's right, in medieval times, shoes were often little more than thin soles, with a bit of leather wrapped around them. No cushy insoles, no arch support, just you and the ground, having a very intimate relationship. These shoes, if we can even call them that, were usually made from a single piece of leather. They were cut, folded, and stitched together in a way that would make modern podiatrists weep. The soles were so thin you could probably feel every pebble, twig, and unfortunate medieval street surprise through them. It was like walking on eggshells, except the eggshells were actually just the hard, unforgiving ground. And let's not forget about the lack of variety. Unlike today, where we have shoes for every occasion. Running shoes, dress shoes, dance shoes, shoes that light up when you walk. Medieval folks had, well, shoes, just shoes. The same pair for working, for church, for dancing, if they were fancy enough to do such things, and for trudging through whatever the streets had to offer. Speaking of streets, let's take a moment to appreciate the medieval road system, or rather, the lack thereof. Most roads were little more than dirt paths that had been walked on so many times they'd formed a sort of route. When it rained, these dirt paths turned into mud paths, and when it was dry, they were dusty paths. Either way, your feet were in for a treat. And by treat, I mean a not-so-pleasant experience. Now, you might be thinking, well, at least they had socks to cushion their feet, right? Oh, sweet summer child. Socks, as we know them, were a luxury that most medieval people couldn't afford. The common folk often went sockless, their bare feet nestled against the leather of their shoes like a sad, sweaty burrito. For those lucky few who did have socks, they were often made of itchy wool or rough linen. Imagine wearing a pair of socks that felt like they were knitted from steel wool and cactus needles. Not exactly the soft, fluffy socks we like to curl up in on a chilly evening. And let's not forget about the joy of putting on damp shoes in the morning. In a world without central heating or efficient drying methods, shoes that got wet, which was probably often given the muddy streets, stayed wet. There's nothing quite like sliding your feet into cold, clammy leather to start your day off right. The lack of proper footwear wasn't just uncomfortable. It could also be downright chilly. Medieval Europe wasn't known for its tropical climate, and those thin shoes did little to keep out the cold. Imagine walking through slushy snow or icy puddles with nothing but a thin piece of leather between your toes and frostbite. It's enough to make you want to curl up under a warm blanket and never leave your bed. But leave their beds they did, these hardy medieval folk. They'd slip their feet into their sad excuses for shoes and venture out into a world where the ground was rarely kind. The cobblestone streets, where they existed, were uneven and treacherous. One misstep and you could find yourself with a twisted ankle or a stubbed toe. And remember, medieval medicine wasn't exactly advanced. A foot injury could be a serious setback. Now you might be wondering about the smell. After all, feet trapped in leather all day without proper ventilation or regular washing. Because who had time for that when there were fields to plow and plagues to avoid? Probably didn't smell like a field of daisies. In fact, the odor was likely strong enough to wake the dead, which, given the medieval penchant for building on top of old graveyards, might not have been entirely impossible. But let's not dwell on such unpleasant thoughts. Instead, let's consider the joy of finally taking off those shoes at the end of a long day. The relief must have been immense, like finally scratching an itch you've been ignoring for hours. Of course, then you'd have to look at your feet, which after a day in medieval shoes probably looked like they'd been through a war. Blisters, calluses, and various shades of dirt would likely decorate your toes like some sort of abstract art. And yet, despite all these discomforts, medieval people persevered. They walked, they worked, they lived their lives, all while their feet silently screamed for mercy. It's a testament to human resilience, really, or perhaps just a reminder of how much we take our modern, cushioned, waterproof, breathable footwear for granted. So the next time you slip on your comfortable shoes, with their arch support and memory foam insoles, take a moment to wiggle your toes in appreciation. Your feet are living in luxury compared to their medieval counterparts. They're practically royalty, nestled in their plush, protective palaces. As we come to the end of our gentle stroll through the world of medieval footwear, I hope you're feeling a bit more relaxed, perhaps even a little drowsy. After all, there's nothing quite like contemplating the minor discomforts of long-ago feet to lull one into a peaceful slumber. Imagine, if you will, waking up on a rainy morning in a medieval village. The first thing you might notice is a gentle drip, drip, drip coming from somewhere above your head. You see, roofs back then weren't quite as watertight as they are today. Thatched roofs were common, made from layers of straw or reeds. While they did a decent job of keeping out most of the rain, they weren't exactly perfect. On particularly rainy days, you might find yourself playing a sleepy game of dodge the drip as you tried to find a dry spot in your humble abode. It was like a very slow, very damp version of musical chairs. Only instead of music stopping, it was just the constant pitter-patter of rain on your roof. And speaking of roofs, let's take a moment to appreciate the medieval roofer. Imagine climbing up onto a slippery, thatched roof to patch up leaks. It was a bit like trying to plug holes in a very large, very unstable sponge. Not the most relaxing job in the world, but someone had to do it. Now, Let's say you managed to avoid the drips and decided to venture outside. Well, my drowsy friend, I hope you like mud. Because in medieval times, rain meant mud. Lots and lots of mud. The streets, which were often just dirt paths, turned into squishy, squelchy messes. Walking through a medieval town on a rainy day was less like a pleasant stroll, and more like a very slow, very messy obstacle course. Each step was a gamble. Would your foot sink into the mud? Would you slip and take an impromptu mud bath? It was like playing a game of the floor is lava, except the floor was mud, and the stakes were slightly less dramatic. And let's not forget about the joy of trying to keep your clothes clean in all this mud. Laundry day in medieval times was already a bit of a chore, what with having to haul water from the well and scrub everything by hand. But add mud to the equation, and suddenly it's like trying to keep a white cat clean in a coal mine. A futile, never-ending task that probably made more than a few medieval folks wonder if being clean was really worth all the effort. Now, you might be thinking, well, surely they had umbrellas or rain boots to help with all this wetness. And to that I say, oh, you sweet summer child. Umbrellas, as we know them, didn't become common in Europe until much later. And as for rain boots, well, let's just say that waterproof footwear wasn't exactly a medieval fashion staple. Instead, people had to make do with what they had. Cloaks were popular, but they were often made of wool, which, while warm, isn't exactly known for its water-repelling properties. So, imagine walking around in what was essentially a very damp, very heavy blanket. It was less singing in the rain, and more squelching in the rain, while wearing a wet sheep. And let's not forget about the joys of wet feet. Medieval shoes were often made of leather, which, as anyone who's ever owned a leather jacket knows, doesn't exactly love water. So, on rainy days, medieval folks were essentially walking around with soggy sponges on their feet. It was like having a very inefficient, very uncomfortable foot bath with every step. But it wasn't all doom and gloom in the rainy medieval world. For instance, rain was great news if you were a medieval farmer. Sure, you might have to trudge through mud to tend your crops, but at least you didn't have to worry about watering them. It was like having a very unreliable, very enthusiastic gardening assistant. And for children, rainy days in medieval times might have been a bit of an adventure. Imagine the joy of splashing in muddy puddles, when your parents couldn't just throw your clothes in the washing machine afterward. It was probably the medieval equivalent of eating ice cream for breakfast, a rare, slightly naughty treat. Now, let's take a moment to appreciate the medieval gutter system, or rather, the lack thereof. In many towns, the streets themselves served as a sort of makeshift drainage system. So when it rained, everything, and I do mean everything, would wash down the middle of the street. It was like a very slow, very smelly version of whitewater rafting, minus the raft. And plus a whole lot of unpleasant surprises. And speaking of unpleasant surprises, let's not forget about the joys of indoor activities on rainy days. Board games weren't exactly common, and television was still a few centuries away. So, What did medieval folks do when stuck inside on a rainy day? Well, they might have told stories, done some sewing, or perhaps engaged in the thrilling activity of watching the leak in the roof slowly fill up a bucket. It was like a very slow, very damp version of watching paint dry. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of rainy days in medieval times was simply staying dry. With no waterproof materials and limited indoor heating, getting wet often meant staying wet for quite some time. It was like being permanently damp, a bit like a human sponge, or perhaps a very unhappy fish who somehow found itself on land. Imagine trying to dry your clothes on a rainy day. You couldn't just toss them in the dryer. No, you had to hang them up and hope for the best. It was a bit like trying to dry a wet towel by waving it around in a steam room. Not exactly the most effective method, but hey, at least you got an arm workout. And let's not forget about the joy of trying to light a fire in damp conditions. Keeping a fire going was crucial for warmth and cooking, but wet wood doesn't exactly burn well. It was like trying to start a campfire with soggy marshmallows. Frustrating, slightly ridiculous, and likely to leave you cold and hungry. But perhaps the most relaxing thing about rainy days in medieval times was the sound. Imagine lying in your bed, listening to the gentle patter of rain on your thatched roof. Sure, you might have to occasionally dodge a drip or two, but there's something undeniably cozy about being inside while it's raining outside. It's a feeling that transcends time, a simple pleasure that our medieval ancestors shared with us. So, as we drift off to sleep, let's take a moment to appreciate our modern conveniences, our waterproof jackets, our sturdy umbrellas, our leak-free roofs, and let's send a drowsy thank you to our medieval ancestors who trudged through the mud and rain so that we could complain about a little drizzle on our way to work. Sweet dreams, my slightly damp friends. May your night be dry, your roof be leak-free, and your feet stay wonderfully unsoggy. Good night.